In the 19th century, the maps of South America still had zones where the line between one country and another depended on a treaty signed thousands of miles away, on a mountain range nobody had accurately measured, or on a desert that nobody wanted because it seemed worthless. The Atacama was one of those places, vast, arid, hostile. A territory that the newly independent states looked at as a margin, an in-between space where sovereignties could overlap without anyone caring too much. But beneath that dry, silent surface lay something that, once global markets discovered it, turned the region into one of the most coveted territories on the continent. What looked like a margin ended up being the center of a war that permanently redrew the map of South America. The second half of the 19th century was a time of fragile construction for Latin America. Countries that had declared independence decades earlier were still fighting external debt, institutional instability, and a constant need for fiscal revenue. In that context, guano and saltpeter became strategic resources of the highest order. Guano, harvested from coastal Pacific islands, was a high-demand fertilizer in Europe and sustained Peruvian finances for decades, though it also created a dangerous dependency. Saltpeter, found in enormous quantities in the Atacama Desert, was an essential ingredient in fertilizers and explosives, and global demand for it kept growing. Whoever controlled those reserves would have access to extraordinary income, and that was exactly what was at stake. The area with the greatest conflict potential was the Bolivian coastline, particularly the province of Antofagasta. Bolivia was a country with a narrow and poorly consolidated outlet to the Pacific Ocean. Mining companies operated in that territory, several of them with Chilean capital, under terms negotiated with the Bolivian government. The 1874 treaty between Chile and Bolivia established that Bolivia would not raise taxes on Chilean companies operating in the region for a period of 25 years. It was a fragile agreement from the start, held together more by mutual necessity than by any real trust. In 1878, Bolivia decided to increase the saltpeter tax paid by the Antofagasta Nitrate and Railway Company, a firm with a Chilean majority stake. Chile protested. Bolivia held firm. And when Bolivia threatened to seize the company's assets, the dispute stopped being diplomatic. On February 14, 1879, Chilean troops landed in Antofagasta. There was no armed resistance at that moment. The port simply changed hands in practice, with a speed that revealed how long that possibility had been in preparation. Bolivia turned to Peru for support, and here enters the most debated piece on the board. There was a secret defensive alliance treaty signed in 1873 between Peru and Bolivia, which obligated Peru to intervene if Bolivia was attacked. Peru had tried to stay out of the conflict and had even offered to mediate. But when Chile declared war on both countries simultaneously in April 1879, the alliance activated, and Peru found itself committed to a conflict it had not directly sought. Peru's economic situation at that moment was precarious. The guano boom had given way to mounting debt, one-sided contracts with foreign creditors, and a saltpeter industry the state had been struggling to nationalize. Peru entered the war with strained finances, a navy in poor shape, and a politically divided leadership. The alliance with Bolivia was real, but the capacity to sustain it was far more uncertain than the formal commitments suggested. The first phase of the war was decided at sea. The Pacific was not just the geographic backdrop for the conflict, it was the strategic artery connecting ports, supplying armies, and moving troops along an enormous coastline. Whoever controlled the sea could dictate the timing and location of the war on land. Chile had a more modern and better organized navy. Peru had older vessels, but among them was one that would become the most powerful symbol of that naval campaign: the ironclad Huáscar, commanded by Miguel Grau. Grau was a seasoned Peruvian naval officer, respected even by his enemies. For months, the Huáscar operated as a remarkably effective disruption force. It attacked Chilean convoys, captured vessels, and sowed uncertainty along enemy supply routes, extending Peruvian resistance at sea well beyond what the numbers would have suggested. The naval battle of Iquique in May 1879 became one of the most remembered episodes of that phase. The Huáscar sank the Chilean corvette Esmeralda in an uneven fight, though Peru also lost one of its own ships that same day. Grau's name became permanently tied to that battle, carrying a mixture of skill, boldness, and tragedy that Peruvian historical memory has never set aside. The Huáscar's campaign ended in October 1879 at the Battle of Angamos. The Chilean Navy managed to intercept the ironclad and sink it after a fierce engagement. Grau died in combat. With his death and the destruction of the Huáscar, Chile secured dominance over the Pacific. That changed everything. Chilean forces could now move freely by sea, land wherever they chose, and strike the enemy coast without effective naval resistance. What followed was a long and brutal land war. Campaigns unfolded across punishing terrain: the Atacama Desert, the highlands of Tacna, the port of Arica. Every advance meant not just military combat, but also the occupation of territories, the control of populations, and the displacement of people whose lives became caught between different flags. The soldiers of all three countries were mostly young men, many of them farmers and indigenous recruits, called up to defend borders they barely knew in any concrete sense. Tarapacá fell under Chilean control in 1879. Arica, after a particularly violent battle, fell in 1880. Peruvian resistance was fierce at several points, but political disorganization, scarce resources, and the loss of the sea weighed decisively against them. In January 1881, Chilean forces entered Lima. It was a military defeat, but it was also something more. The occupation of a capital carries a symbolic wound of a different magnitude. Lima was occupied for years. Peruvian institutions scattered. The state tried to reorganize from the interior of the country under enormous difficulty, with a political fragmentation that delayed any peace agreement. The treaties came in stages. In 1883, Chile and Peru signed the Treaty of Ancón. Peru ceded the province of Tarapacá permanently, and the provinces of Tacna and Arica were placed under Chilean administration for 10 years, with a plebiscite that was never held within the agreed timeframe. That question remained open for decades and was only partially resolved in 1929 when Tacna was returned to Peru and Arica remained definitively in Chilean hands. Bolivia signed a truce agreement with Chile in 1884, without a final peace treaty. That agreement left Bolivia without sovereign access to the Pacific Ocean. Antofagasta, the port that had been the trigger for the entire conflict, was integrated into Chilean territory. What Bolivia lost was not just land. It lost the ability to project itself toward the sea, to control its own exports, to have direct access to Pacific trade routes. That loss was never filed away in history books. It became a permanent grievance, a national cause repeated across every generation, a demand that Bolivia has brought before international courts and forums to this day. The War of the Pacific was not a war of pure villains or perfect victims. It was the result of a combination of forces that fed on each other: natural resources of enormous value, young states with poorly defined borders, treaties that depended more on short-term convenience than on solid agreements, business interests that pressured governments, and a regional logic where every country was trying to assert its position. Saltpeter did not cause the war on its own. But without it, the conflict would have taken a different shape. The minerals of the Atacama were not just wealth. They were fiscal power, regional influence, and reason of state. What remained afterward was far more than a new map. Cities remained that changed their official names, but not their memory. Families remained divided by borders drawn where none had existed before. Schools remained teaching different versions of the same conflict. Bolivia remained without a coastline, pressing its claim in every international forum as what it considers an unresolved historical debt. Peru remained with its lost provinces as a painful presence in the national memory. Chile remained with an expanded northern territory, but also with the weight of being the country that won that war, and everything that implies for regional relationships. Some borders are drawn with ink on paper. Others are drawn with saltpeter, with debt, with wounded pride, with battles nobody entirely chose, and with losses that following generations carry, without having lived through them directly. The Atacama is still there, arid and vast, but nobody calls it empty anymore.